Cotabato, southern Philippines, August 19, 1976. A town shattered and shocked by the biggest natural disaster the Philippines has ever suffered. This was the scene 2 days after an earthquake struck without warning and brought sudden death and destruction to a large area of the country. The center of the quake was about 100 miles off the coast out in the Celebes Sea, but its intensity, put at 7.8 on the Richter scale, was only slightly less than the tremor that killed over 100,000 people in China in July. It brought chaos and suffering to the island of Mindanao, 500 miles south of Manila. For the towns, the quake was bad enough, but the coastal areas suffered even more cruelly from a series of massive tidal waves that rushed inland with devastating force. From the air, the pattern of devastation was appalling. Huge swathes of mud covered areas where fishermen's homes once stood. Whole communities disappeared, literally wiped off the face of the earth by a moving wall of water that was 30 feet high. In Cotabato, a city of 100,000 people, 1,500 died when housing blocks, a restaurant, a college, and 2 4-story hotels collapsed. The government in Manila proclaimed a national calamity and drafted thousands of troops to help with rescue work and rehabilitation. As the soldiers fought to free the injured, there were scores of individual stories of heroism and tragedy, like the Cotabato lawyer who worked all night with the army trying to reach his wife, 3 children and mother-in-law under the rubble of their apartment. He could see his wife and speak to her, but he couldn't reach her, and she died in the wreckage the following morning. The full extent of the disaster became clear as different areas of Mindanao reported their casualties to a national coordinating committee. 4,000 dead, 4,000 missing, probably dead, and nearly 2,000 injured. Pagadian, 80 miles northwest of Cotabato, lies on the Gulf of Morro and took the full force of the tidal waves. When our camera team flew over the town 4 days after the disaster, virtually every street was still under water or beneath thick layers of mud. Here too, the smaller coastal villages had suffered terribly. Many of the traditional dwellings, wooden houses raised on stilts, had been reduced to little more than matchwood. Troops sifting the wreckage for bodies wore masks to keep out the stench of corpses. This baby was the youngest child of Marthiel Del Monte. She was only 8 months old and one of 3 children Mr. Del Monte lost in the deluge. Her father led her pathetic funeral procession across the rubble-strewn area that had once been their village. In Manila, relief operations were organized by the Air Force and Army, with help coming from various international charities. Supplies of protein-enriched biscuits, dried milk and soya flour were rushed to the stricken areas in the south. President Marcos refused offers of foreign aid, claiming the Philippines could and should meet the needs of its people from its own resources. The offer of an American aircraft carrier for relief operations was politely refused, possibly because of the sensitive state of negotiations between Manila and Washington on the issue of US-controlled bases in the Philippines. President Marcos wants complete Filipino sovereignty over the existing American installations, a demand that Washington has so far refused to concede. Touring the devastated areas with her husband was the president's wife, Imelda. Mrs. Marcos is a powerful political figure in her own right. She's the governor of Manila, and so no stranger to the complex problems of large-scale organization. She listened attentively while officials explained the situation. At Zamboanga, she made her own notes as relief workers from the Department of Social Welfare explained what was needed to rebuild the coastal towns. One result of these briefings was the transfer of house-building priorities from Manila to Mindanao, where the need is clearly more urgent. The government ordered the evacuation of the coastal areas in case of further tremors. And so thousands of refugees found their way to the temporary camps that have been set up all over the south. This stadium at Pagadian houses several hundred families in conditions of safety, if not comfort. These people are just a few of 200,000 who will eventually have to be rehoused. At the moment, the only sustenance for these refugees is the food handed out by the government or the international charities. It is eagerly and gratefully received. And food is not the only problem. More than 1,000 schools were destroyed by the quake, and until they're rebuilt, the education of these children will be held back. Although regarding the quake as a national calamity, President Marcos also referred to the disaster's silver lining, the creation of national unity. The people of Mindanao are Muslims, and in recent years, many of them have given their support to a rebellion aimed at secession, or at least autonomy, from the Christian North. How the disaster will affect that rebellion is difficult to predict. There have been reports of renewed armed clashes in the last few days as some rebel leaders have tried to take advantage of the general disorganization in the cities. But the government also claims to be seeking quiet negotiations between rival local commanders to end hostilities. At this center, army personnel are assisting ordinary people to find their missing relatives. On the face of it, it does seem to show a genuine desire to help. There are other practical examples of the army coming to the aid of a formerly hostile people. The people of Cotabato have taken to using the traditional bancos, or flat-bottomed boats, to cross the river because the quake destroyed one span of the bridge. The army is now repairing the bridge, and if Manila is to be believed, the soldiers who've been used to fighting the South will now be employed to rebuild it. By any standards, that task is a monumental one. According to President Marcos, the rehabilitation of Mindanao will take 5 years and cost $140 million. A special plan is being drawn up to organize the work. And with that plan, go hopes on both sides that reconstruction will not stop at buildings, but will also create new attitudes of tolerance and mutual respect among the Philippines' different communities.